Hi there, Higher Politics. Hope everything is going okay. Just going to introduce our final section of the Higher Politics course. You'll be delighted to hear. And the final section is dominant ideas within and between political parties. Okay, so what we're talking about here, folks, is not policies. We're not talking about policies or leadership or anything like that. What we're looking at is the kind of themes, the kind of key dominant ideas that basically the party that we're looking at, is based on. Okay, what their platform is based on, what their ideology is, what their key themes are within the party. Okay, we need to do a wee bit more than that, though. It's not just enough to know about what the key themes are. We want to assess their electoral impact, how these ideas chime with voters when it comes to polling day, and even looking at opinion polls themselves. Okay, so obviously this video is but one part, and you'll notice I've called it Section 3A. Okay, Section 3A. And we're going to be looking at the Scottish National Party, the SNP, post-2014. Okay, now the reason why I've chosen post-2014 is because 2014 was an important kind of line in the sand for the SNP, because after that they became unquestionably the dominant party within Scottish politics. They had a range of success leading up to 2014, but it was the independence referendum that allowed them to, or gave them a springboard to become the entrenched strongest party within Scotland. Okay, up until that point, it was fair to argue that Labour had broadly a strong hegemony within Scotland. It dominated the Scottish political landscape. It was starting to lose its grip on it slightly, Labour, in the late noughties, although it did very well in the 2010 general election. But post-2014, the SNP have done very well. Okay, it's not that they have dipped at points, but they have maintained their position as Scotland's leading and most popular party. Okay, so we want to know what the key themes are and what effect these key themes and key ideas have had within the Scottish National Party's election campaigns. Okay, so Section 3A, Scottish National Party. I should say at this point, folks, the next video that will come out after this will look at the Conservative Party within the same time frame, and look at how their ideas, compare to the SNP's, and how they actually work out the polls. But this video is solely based on the SNP, so make sure that you are fully invested in looking at the SNP post-2014 here. Okay, so move myself over here. Yep, right. I'm going to look at simply three key ideas that have defined the SNP over the course of the last decade. Okay. One of their ideas kind of came to prominence after the referendum, just after the referendum in 2014, and that was stronger for Scotland. And in fact, a lot of SNP supporters, you will see badges or kind of window stickers in their car that still says stronger for Scotland. It's become a key phrase of the SNP, a key soundbite that they've used, but they obviously pin that to different policies. That is a theme that runs right throughout their campaigns. Obviously, the SNP are the main pro-independence party within Scotland, the largest pro-independence party within Scotland. But the stronger for Scotland idea was to be broader than this. It was to appeal to people who were maybe not in favour of independence, but it looked to champion the SNP as the party which was supposed to stand up for Scottish interests. Okay. Secondly, is Scotland and Europe. The SNP does have people within the party that oppose the European Union, but it is mainly a pro-EU party. Okay. There are two phrases that we use for people's positions on the EU. One is Eurosceptic, if you're against the EU, or you're hostile or perhaps a bit sceptical of the EU, you're Eurosceptic. And if you're in favour of the EU, you are Europhile. Okay, so the SNP would be seen as a Europhile party. And after the EU referendum in 2016, this theme of the SNP's platform became even more pronounced. It became even stronger during that period. And some have linked this Scotland and Europe to the SNP's current case, and I'm speaking in 2021, current case for a second independence referendum. Okay. The third one is anti-austerity. So this is a kind of broad economic stance. The SNP in the past was seen as a party that maybe wasn't a party of the centre-left. It was, in some respects, a party of the centre-right. And if you want to check out a wee bit more of this, folks, you can have a wee look at one of the documentaries from on YouTube. It was Michael Portillo interviewing former leader Alex Salmond. And key figures within the party like Jean Freeman would say that the SNP used to sit on the centre-right at certain points. Some politicians perhaps still do within the party, but it is broadly a left-of-centre party now, and its key economic idea in recent years has been opposing austerity. This idea of cutting back on public spending, this idea of enforcing cuts to balance the budget. So they have been vocally anti-austerity, particularly at the time when the Conservative Party was promoting a pro-austerity agenda. Okay, so it's important to say that. Okay, and again, if you were to look historically at the SNP, it would maybe be very different. Remember, the SNP isn't a party of social democracy, socialism, whatever. It's not a party of that. It's a party of Scottish self-determination. So throughout different times, and even today, it's got different views on economics within its party. Okay, in the past, some people referred to the SNP as tartan Tories. Today, some people argue that the SNP are to the left of Labour. Okay, so the SNP's anti-austerity platform has been a key theme, a key strand running through its recent election campaigns. And we're going to look how it obviously performs at elections. Now, obviously, the SNP only stands in Scotland, so we can only look at their impact among the Scottish electorate. However, as it stands, the SNP are the third largest, or third biggest represented party within the UK Parliament. They're ahead of the Liberal Democrats, even though the Lib Dems stand across the country. And that's because they have won most of the seats in Scotland at the last UK general election. And that gives them a solid block within the UK Parliament. They're in power in Scotland and Holyrood as well. So they're enjoying quite a significant period of dominance within Scottish politics. And obviously we'll see how that kind of plays out, okay? I have said we're looking at post-2014. So if you listen carefully, the few elections, we're just not going to look at one election, so we're going to look at their impact over a few election cycles. The first one is the 2015 UK general election. That's the first big election we're going to consider. Secondly, we're going to look at the 2016 Scottish Parliament election. Next, the UK general election of 2017, and then the UK general election of 2019. Now, obviously, as I speak here at the moment, we're actually in the run-up to another election, and that's the Scottish parliamentary elections of 2021, where the SNP are aiming for an overall majority. Now, they're very, very popular in the polls. What I want to say is it's very, very difficult for any party to win an overall majority in the Scottish parliamentary election system. So it's worth kind of watching out how that ends up, folks, in the election in May. Okay, so let's have a look. Right, let's make the face smaller here. There we go. Right, okay. So just want to give you a wee bit of background before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of this, okay? I've said here the SNP has always been a party of Scottish self-determination. Now, you'll notice I have very carefully not said it's always been a party of Scottish independence. If you look in the early days of the party, you would find a lot of evidence that suggested the SNP wasn't overtly for independence. The SNP was a combination. It was an amalgamation of the National Party of Scotland and the Scottish Party, which came together to form the Scottish National Party. And at that time, the idea of Scottish independence was not clearly supported by a lot of its adherents, a lot of its supporters. Many of them hoped for a kind of home rule settlement or devolution. But in the very early days, the SNP was not clearly a party of Scottish independence, but it has become defined as a party of Scottish independence. We've got a background here in Scotland as well. Okay, for many years, it struggled to gain any foothold in Scotland because Labour dominated the political landscape. Okay, particularly post-Thatcher, The SNP really struggled to compete with Labour, who were viewed as the defenders of the working class, the defenders of industrial Scotland at that time. And the SNP struggled to really get any kind of breakthrough with them. And in fact, in 1979, the SNP it had its highest number of MPs at that point. It was 11 MPs, and many of them, in fact, the SNP group voted a vote of no confidence in the Labour government, which then brought down the Labour government, and then Thatcher won the ensuing election. So for many in Scotland, they accused the SNP of being tartan Tories, of siding with Thatcher, and it took quite a while for the SNP to recover. During the course of the 80s, there was a struggle within the party between those who wanted to promote independence immediately, those who wanted to bring it about gradually through devolution. And it was at this time that the SNP took on more of a left of centre platform, and that was largely due to a group called the 79 Group. One of their key members was Alex Salmond. Alex Salmond was actually suspended from the SNP, and because of his activities. But Alex Salmond felt that the only way that you could supplant the Labour Party in Scotland was by challenging them on the left of the political spectrum, and that's going to be important as we move throughout this, folks. Okay. So, at time of writing, the SNP is the most popular party in Scotland and is growing increasingly confident. Okay, as it stands, folks, we've had a number of polls, opinion polls, that suggest that Scottish independence is favoured by the majority of the population, which is obviously a switch, because I think there had only been one rogue poll in the last few years that even suggested that. In fact, Scottish independence had always stagnated at about 28-29% in the opinion polls, and it wasn't until the referendum that they really got a breakthrough to be even nearly neck and neck with a pro-union stance within Scotland. And as I said, the SNP have always struggled to gain a clear constituency of voters. Labour always had the working classes. They'd always had the industrial, former coal mining heartlands, whereas the SNP, kind of nibbled around the edges of kind of more rural constituencies. And in fact, in the 1950s, the Conservatives, they were the only party, they were known as the Unionists at the time, they were the only party that ever achieved over 50% of the vote within Scottish elections. So for many years, the SNP struggled to make any sort of a breakthrough. In the late 90s, early 2000s, they kind of hovered at about 6 or 7 seats in the UK Parliament, and after the creation of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, were the second largest party within Holyrood. But it did appear for a long time as that the SNP didn't have a core set of voters that would allow them to challenge the Labour Party. But that all began to change, because Scottish politics began to change. Okay, so just another wee bit of background here, folks. Been a number of Scottish Parliament elections since its creation in 1999, and the SNP finished second in 1999. They finished a dire second in 2003, and it looks as if there was no way back for them. By 2003, or after the election of 2003, Alex Salmond returned to lead the party for the second time, okay, replacing John Swinney, who had replaced Alex Salmond. So in 2007, the SNP began to gain a bit of momentum in the polls, and a lot of people began to think, could they challenge Labour to be the number one party in the Scottish Parliament? And in the 2007 election, it was a hotly contested battle between the Labour First Minister Jack McConnell and the challenger at the time, Alex Salmond. Now, Alex Salmond was an MP at that time in Westminster, and Nicola Sturgeon, the deputy at the time, had led the group from within the Scottish Parliament. But Alex Salmond stood for the Scottish Parliament, and that night the SNP did very well, and at the end of it, it was a neck and neck. I remember it really well, folks. It was neck and neck until the next morning, and it emerged that the SNP had won one more seat than the Labour Party, won one more seat. Now, that's not a majority, an overall majority, or anything like it, but there was a sense that Labour had been defeated there, that the SNP had broken the back of Labour dominance within Scotland. So in 2007, the SNP formed a minority government. It meant that they would have to deal with other parties, But for the first time, the SNP had their foot in the door. And in actual fact, at that point, they didn't really campaign on independence. It wasn't really a priority. They wanted to show that they could govern Scotland effectively, to be taken seriously as a political force and not just a protest force in Scotland. In 2011, they upset all the odds. Okay, they had quite an ordinary performance in the 2010 general election. Scottish voters came out quite firmly for the then Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown in 2010 in the UK general election. A year later, at the Holyrood Scottish elections, the SNP completely upset the odds. They won the election with an overall majority, and it was felt that it was impossible that you could do that within the Scottish Parliament because of the electoral system. So the SNP had a mandate to put forward an independence referendum, and David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, signed off on that. So independence was then on the table, folks, and the SNP was in government. Okay. Now, again, we're not really into the kind of nitty-gritty yet, but this is absolutely vitally important. I'm going to show you a short video in just a wee minute, just to give you a sense of the rise of the SNP from a protest party, essentially a party that was at one point viewed as kind of eccentric, for eccentrics, to being the governing party of Scotland. 2014, now if you look at this map here, it looks as if pretty much all of Scotland voted no, because that's each local authority area. This means that 28 of these local authority areas voted no to independence in terms of majority. But if you add up the individual votes, it was a 45-55% split. Now, it's still quite a comfortable win for no in the Scottish independence referendum. But the Yes campaign getting 45% was significant. And what it allowed it to do is it allowed it to reshape Scottish politics, because moving forward, those who voted yes became almost emotionally invested in yes. And barring the likes of the Green Party, the only major party that was in favour of independence was the SNP. So those who voted yes, who then viewed it as part of their identity, largely stuck with the SNP, or moved to the SNP in the next election. The no vote was divided up by Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat. So even though the SNP failed to get their way in 2014 by winning the independence referendum, they won enough voters over to yes to then translate that into SNP voters at future elections. And even still, we're still seeing that, folks, that Scottish politics is divided along constitutional lines. There are three major unionist parties, or pro-union parties, Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and the votes split up along with them. Whereas the Greens and the SNP, the votes largely go to the SNP because they are viewed as the main route to independence, I suppose. Okay, so I'm going to show you a short video here about the rise of the SNP, a wee bit of background, just to kind of tease out what I've already said, and then we'll get into the kind of key elements in just a wee second, folks. Okay, so watch closely.
This is a great white shark, and this is the Scottish National Party's spring conference. The link, as the shark's tooth falls out, another equally sharp and effective one slots straight into place, leaving the organism stronger than ever. And that, my friends, is the essence of the great white shark political miracle the SNP has pulled off.
And vote SNP to make our...
From the potential disaster of the referendum defeat back in September, the party boss exhausted in the pre-dawn gloom.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's been a pretty fair kick of the ball.
But then look what happened. The party replaced Alex Salmond, arguably...
Sorry, folks. Wee bit of an interruption there. Hopefully that's it sorted.
The most effective British politician, with Nicola Sturgeon, unarguably, at the dispatch box and ballot box, the most effective British politician. Shark's teeth, all right. The journey to the modern SNP begins around 2007. They were in a minority government, but all the while, somehow making the old dominant Labour Party feel out of touch to voters. Their victory in the Glasgow East by-election the following year, a sign of what was to come. By 2011, they had a majority, Alex Salmond leading the party to control Holyrood, and the timetable to independence and the referendum started ticking. Last autumn's independence referendum campaign had to be witnessed to be believed.
Yes, 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 yes!
All the old apathy of British politics somehow gone as people of all ages engaged.
We're close, it can actually happen. I didn't think it could happen, but it could happen. We can do this!
A promise of more devolution from the major party leaders might have kept Scotland in the Union, but the SNP Yes campaign energy didn't dissipate with defeat.
A little after 5:30 here in George Square, and the crowds are thinning out. Recognition that the result is a no. But two messages from young people here. First is that politics has changed in this country and changed forever.
When the Prime Minister came out the day after the result and said that Scottish devolution would be settled, along with the question of English votes for English laws, many Scots again felt shut out from the Westminster process, and the momentum rolled again. And then that masterstroke, the shark's tooth moment. The SNP putting on over 100,000 members across the winter, by far the fastest growing British party. Nicola Sturgeon filling venues normally booked by global rock stars. She was the selfie sensation of an SNP election landslide this year, when she wasn't even standing. Queen of the TV debate, punters across Britain voted her the best party leader, let alone the Scots.
We really need to break the old boys' network at Westminster.
And all done with the SNP not even campaigning for independence in the election. The day after the poll, 56 SNP MPs line up beneath the Forth Bridge. The English looked on amazed and surprised. In fact, though, it was just the logical progression of the rise and rise of the Nats.
Rather like the flying conditions today, it's been a pretty smooth ride for the SNP throughout this election campaign. But they know, as well as anybody else, that the really tough business is yet to come after the election and after the poll.
Which all now leaves David Cameron with a high wire act. The SNP say 56 MPs is not a mandate for independence, and they plough on towards full fiscal autonomy for their country. Until recently, they were more anti-austerity than any other major British party. There is a but, though. The SNP won all those seats on an anti-austerity platform. They repeatedly said they weren't campaigning for independence in the election. But the new Labour leader is now very firmly on their turf. It was a massive upset when Jeremy Corbyn took control of the party. In left-leaning Scotland, could he somehow pull off yet another shock victory there? Well, trying to fend him off on the one hand and keep independence, of course, centrally on the agenda may be the party's toughest challenge yet. But watch what's happening. The recent fox hunting intervention turned what was in fact a grotesque political U-turn against party policy not to interfere in English politics into a triumph.
That underlines that David Cameron is not master of all he surveys in the House of Commons. He's got a fragile majority.
Then, the very same day, Mhairi Black's barnstorming maiden speech.
We now have one of the most uncaring, uncompromising and out-of-touch governments that the UK has seen since Thatcher.
David Cameron has a major dilemma. If there is a vote to leave the EU, or even if he gets scratchy on fiscal autonomy, the SNP can and will say, louder and louder, that Tory England is forcing independence back onto the agenda. And which Tory would be bold enough to gamble once more on another indie ref, but this time led by the selfie queen herself and the 56 of the Commons.
Now, obviously, folks, that was put together, that video, just after the 2015 election, so obviously some of that has become outdated slightly. You've heard when Jeremy Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party that he might have tried to kind of oust the SNP from being the kind of anti-austerity party within Scotland, and we'll talk a wee bit about that, especially when it comes to the 2017 election, just shortly, okay? But hopefully that kind of gives you a wee bit of background in terms of the lead up to the SNP's recent dominance of Scottish politics. So, moved on a wee bit farther. Right, okay, so the first kind of key idea that we're going to look at here is Stronger for Scotland. And I said at the outset, folks, that Stronger for Scotland is something that's broader than simply, say, independence for Scotland. It hints at, and it's deliberately hinting at, attracting voters who want more powers for Scotland. Now, if those who want more powers for Scotland are put into a room, that would be bigger than the room that was simply for independence, because there is a general tendency to want increased powers for the Holyrood Parliament. Moreover, there is a sense that voters are looking for a party which champions Scottish interests. And the SNP realised this in the wake of the 2014 referendum. They knew that it was too soon to campaign for independence again. So what they said is, we've got a lot of pro-independence energy, we've got a lot of people who maybe want to see additional powers for the Scottish Parliament. They want Scotland's voice to be heard after the independence referendum. So if we frame ourselves as the Scottish Party, the Stronger for Scotland Party, then that will be of great benefit to us. Okay, and here are the key principles for that campaign, Stronger for Scotland. 45% of voters, and I mentioned this earlier, were unlikely to migrate back to pro-UK parties, at least immediately, so soon after the referendum. Okay, people were, as I said, were emotionally invested in yes in the independence referendum, and many of them couldn't see themselves voting for any other party than the SNP, okay, unless it was like a Green Party or one of the left-wing pro-independent socialist parties. But they viewed the SNP as the party that best represented them. Many of them were ex-Labour voters, and once they had made that jump away from Labour policy on the referendum, they found it easier to then segue into supporting the SNP in 2015. Okay, and that allowed the SNP to portray themselves as the champions of Scottish interests. We will always speak up for Scotland, we will always stand up for Scotland, was the mantra that was used, okay? And that connects incredibly well with Scottish voters, especially in light of the independence referendum, folks. Whether they voted yes or no, there was an appetite for more power for Scotland, more devolution, a stronger voice at Westminster for Scotland. And again, the strong Labour hegemony that had taken place before, the SNP realised that the attachment that voters were having to Labour had become frayed during the independence referendum. And very often, Alex Salmond previously, and then Nicola Sturgeon, would use the phrase that Labour were in bed with the Tories in the independence referendum, or arm in arm or shoulder to shoulder with the Tories. It was quite effective terminology to use, and Labour were very uncomfortable because the Labour had always defined themselves as being kind of anti-conservative. They were the big rivals, the big enemy. And Labour were always the party for Scottish interests. It was harder to argue that for Labour, and especially if they had been painted as collaborators with the Tories. Obviously, Labour would deny that, but it became quite an uncomfortable. Labour were between a rock and a hard place here, and the SNP exploited that really effectively. And as well as that, as we've said, a number of no voters weren't in favour of independence. The SNP said in their manifesto in 2015 this was not a vote for independence. And that was the honey that brought a lot of kind of no voters over to the SNP in 2015, because there was an assurance that it wasn't a vote for independence. It was a vote for a stronger Scottish voice. It was stronger for Scotland, And Nicola Sturgeon, I think, executed that campaign quite effectively, folks, as we'll see from the actual results. Okay, and again, if you look at the kind of the campaign materials, the campaign slogans, this was emblazoned everywhere. Okay, now I'm going to show you another short clip here, and it's a campaign video from the SNP for 2015, and it sums up this kind of campaign tactic. It was deliberately aimed at yes voters from the independence referendum, but also soft no voters, those who wanted or were typically Labour voters in particular, to support the idea of backing the SNP to give Scotland a stronger voice, to give Scotland more powers, that the SNP would always be fighting for more powers for Scotland. That was the idea. And it's the actor Mark Compston who's in this, and he does the campaign video. So I'm going to show you it. And remember, this is the theme that they've carried throughout many elections. This short video was actually repeated in 2019 with some small amendments to show that the theme of Stronger for Scotland still runs through SNP thinking. Because Stronger for Scotland is something that can be used for independence, it can be used for more powers, it can be used just for standing up for Scotland. It's almost like a blank canvas, that, and it's something that voters would find very hard to disagree with. So I'm going to show you the short video from 2015. Keep in mind that this was recycled in 2019 with some slight changes to accommodate the way in which the argument had evolved. So have a look, folks.
This is our place, our country. I don't think we're better than any other country, but I think we're every bit as good. And I know we're capable of doing more given half a chance. Sure, it can be a wee bit rough around the edges sometimes. And it's fair to say we like having a laugh. But that doesn't mean to say we don't care. We care passionately. I know we can be an argumentative bunch. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if it gets stuff done. Proud, optimistic, full of hope, and gallus as hell on occasion. No apologies. That's just who we are. I know where I'm from. What I'm asking is, where are we going? Last year was a roller coaster. Everyone wants change now. And there's an election coming up. I remember when Labour used to stand up to the Tories. That's just not happening anymore. It's time for new ideas. Something positive. Something different from cuts, cuts, cuts. So who's going to shout no way, enough to unfair policies? Who's going to look out for our kids, for our jobs, for our NHS? And who's going to keep Westminster to its promise of more power for Scotland? The question for us here in Scotland isn't which Westminster party will become the next UK government. The question is, who's really going to stand up for Scotland? Well,
now, having watched that video, and I've watched it a number of times, folks, is that what you see there, it's actually very clever, because the Stronger for Scotland thing, it's almost a way of getting out the pro-independence vote, first of all, okay? That's almost a reminder about how the SNP is the party that's kind of most likely to support independence, although independence is not overtly mentioned, okay? Secondly, it does say, I remember when Labour used to stand up to the Tories, that is a deliberate appeal to Labour voters, especially those who had shifted towards independence in 2014, but may have been tempted to move back to Labour. So it was a way of saying, you know, this is what you need to do. You need to vote SNP, you know, if you really dislike the Tories. And that's an appeal to Labour voters specifically, which obviously had a cut through, as we'll see very shortly, folks. It talks about there's got to be more than cuts, cuts, cuts. that's an appeal to the anti-austerity platform that they believed cut through with voters. Again, many of them being traditional Labour voters. Okay, and that's the thing, folks, is that if you have a look at the SNP electorate, the SNP electorate is kind of made up of people who are, you know, pro-independence and have no other political views, many of whom are maybe on the right. But their recent success has been from basically absorbing traditional Labour voters, and Labour have found it really tough to try and kind of find a solution to it. So I think that advert was very effective for what it was supposed to do. And again, if you have the chance, folks, have a look at the advert from 2019. Independence is more overtly put in there in light of Brexit, when it says, you know, enough is enough. It tries to kind of go more strongly down the independence route because they believe that more people have switched to being open to independence in 2019 and 2020. So keep in mind that that theme, Stronger for Scotland, is like a blank canvas that can be used and can pin a lot of people. A lot of people can pin their own ideas to it. Very, very effective. So how effective actually was it? Okay, if we look at 2015. This is the electoral map of Scotland in the 2010 UK general election. Now, you know, Labour win the vast majority of seats. And in fact, Labour increased their vote in this. Now, this is partly due to the fact that Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. Gordon Brown, the Scottish Labour Prime Minister at the time, very popular in Scotland. And the SNP couldn't really get much of a look in the 2010 UK general election. It was seen as a kind of, you know, will Brown hold on to power? Will he fend off David Cameron? And as you can see, in 2010, the SNP at a Westminster election came third in terms of the actual number of seats gained. So fast forward to 2015, okay, the SNP won 56 out of 59 seats and came very close actually to winning a clean sweep. In fact, the one I think they were furthest from getting was Orkney and Shetland, which probably is very, very difficult to get at any point, because it's quite strongly Liberal Democrat. But they almost had a clean sweep of the board. Now, that was with over 50% of the vote. Or sorry, I think it was just bang on 50% of the vote. Because of the electoral system, that would mean that they won pretty much every constituency. Now, it's clear that obviously they've wiped Labour out pretty much. But they've also taken Liberal Democrat seats. The Liberal Democrats, again, a party traditionally in the centre-left. So what they were able to do was kind of break through into the Labour vote, and many commentators put this down to the Stronger for Scotland strategy. And again, the big victims of this, as I've mentioned already, folks, was Labour, as we can see here. Okay, now, watching it on the night was remarkable because it was clear that this was no ordinary election. It was clear that this was a seismic shift in Scottish politics. Very rarely do you get shift on this level. Okay, when Tony Blair came to power in 1997, the national swing away from the Conservatives to Labour was, I think it was, I'm trying to think if it was about 10%, maybe even less than 10%. Yeah, I think it was probably less than 10% in terms of the swing away. You had swings away from Labour, okay, and if you're unsure about the phrase swing, folks, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but look it up. You know, the political commentator Jon Snow used to speak about it quite a bit. But there was some swings of up to 35% away from Labour to the SNP. Now, my own constituency, and I mentioned this a few times, back in 2005 and 2010, there was about a 20,000 vote majority in favour of Labour. In 2015, the SNP walked away with this seat in Coatbridge, Christ and Bellshill with about a 10,000 majority themselves. So they'd actually completely swung things round. Now, that suggests more than simply having a popular policy here and there. It cut to the heart of this idea that the SNP was now stronger for Scotland. That Labour traditionally had been viewed as quite a Scottish party. Its roots were Scottish, some of its key figures were Scottish. For many voters, Labour had vacated their position as the party which stood up for Scotland's interests, and it had been supplanted by the SNP. And as you can see, back then the Scottish Labour leader, obviously at UK level it was Ed Miliband who led the party, but Jim Murphy lost his seat in the 2015 election in Paisley and Renfrewshire, he was East Renfrewshire, and Douglas Alexander in Paisley and Renfrew lost to Mary Black, who was the youngest MP elected in well over 100 years. Now it's interesting. This is how remarkable this is. Mary Black was studying for her degree at this time. She was still at university, still a student. And only a few weeks before this, Douglas Alexander, as Shadow Foreign Secretary, had been sitting in the Oval Office with Barack Obama, President of the United States. It just shows you how much things had swung. These guys had been big figures within the Labour movement for many decades, for many years, over the course of a couple of decades. And they had been swept aside in a huge SNP landslide. And commentators kind of put it down to this idea that the SNP had effectively communicated themselves, had portrayed themselves as the champions of Scotland, those who would stand up and speak up for Scotland. Okay, so what to maybe do, folks, is have a look at this theme, have a bit of research, maybe look at how many Labour voters had kind of shifted over in particular. Because up until this point, although Labour had never been a nationalist party, they were the party of devolution, they were the party that brought about the Scottish Parliament, they were the party that always was viewed as the antidote to Thatcher in Scotland. And obviously they had lost that element, they'd lost that kind of sense of being the Scottish party. Okay? Right, okay, second kind of key aspect is Scotland and Europe. Okay, and as I said at the very start, is that it had for some time been viewed as a party which supported independence in Europe, although it had never been a kind of key part of their campaign. That all changed in 2016. Okay, the EU referendum occurs, and Nicola Sturgeon and other SNP figures had always said that if Scotland votes to remain and England votes to leave, then you're going to end up with a bit of a constitutional crisis, because that could potentially trigger another independence referendum, because Scotland would be dragged out the EU against its will. And that's been something that's been repeated constantly. Now, if you have a look here at the actual votes, obviously it finished 52% versus 48% in favour of leave. Now, two nations in the UK voted on balance to remain. That was Scotland and Northern Ireland. And two voted to leave, England and Wales. Now, every local authority area in Scotland voted to remain. And if you have a look at the stats there, 62%, that's quite a comfortable number. Now, still over 1 million people voted to leave in Scotland, but a clear majority won and voted to remain. Obviously, this was a UK-wide poll, so that resulted in Scotland's numbers, the Remain numbers being outmanoeuvred. That meant that overall, the UK would leave the European Union. Now, this allowed Nicola Sturgeon to promote a kind of democratic deficit here by saying, this is unfair, Scotland voted one way, we've been dragged out, the EU against their will. And this became a key element of their strategy. This became a key point of what they would be campaigning on post-2016. Okay? It's worth noting here that Scottish Parliament elections took place in 2016 a few weeks before the referendum, so we wouldn't look at the impact in the 2016 Scottish election. Okay, we'd be looking at 2017 UK election and 2019 UK election in terms of how well this policy is backed, or how well this view is backed. Okay, and as we can see there, Nicola Sturgeon, began to use a lot of the campaigning platforms to really big up Scotland's European credentials. You can see the kind of EU flag in the background there on SNP colours. Scotland's for Europe, stop Brexit. She made it very clear in the 2017 and 2019 election campaigns that Scotland being dragged out the EU against its will, that was her words, was something that was a reason why the SNP should be supported, because the SNP would stand up for Scotland's place in Europe. Now, they didn't automatically say that this was that this was a reason to vote for independence. They began to say that an independence referendum should be something that's on the table. So they began to introduce that again post 2016 because of the European issue. So it became a key pillar and still a key pillar of their strategy, folks. So did it help the SNP? Okay. Now there's two sides to this debate here, folks. Okay, and obviously you'd look at this kind of going on here in terms of how much traction this has got. I think, and it's just my personal view, I think the SNP perhaps have exaggerated, I don't mean exaggerated, but has perhaps overstated somewhat, or misunderstood the depth this issue has. I don't think that the EU issue is as potent among the Scottish electorate as they may think it is, okay? However, I think the EU issue is perhaps representative of something else, and it's the idea of Scotland being dragged out the EU against its will. If anything, that's probably the element that has most traction with voters, rather than the EU per se, okay? And I'm willing to kind of look at the data in that, folks. That's just kind of a wee observation that I've had. And again, data might bear me out to be wrong in that one, okay? So it's just worth considering and weighing up, but that's a kind of nuanced way of thinking that you might want to think that it's maybe not the EU issue overtly, but it's maybe the EU is maybe a symptom of a deeper issue that the SNP can kind of cut through on. So anyway, Scotland and Europe. Has this stance helped the SNP? So on the one hand, in 2019, Scottish voters appeared to be quite concerned over the prospect of a no-deal Brexit by Boris Johnson. And again, Boris Johnson led a very, very pro-Brexit position campaign in 2019. The SNP ran something quite contrary to that, and Labour kind of gets squeezed in the middle there. So it's possible to say that the Scottish voters became quite aware to the risks of Brexit, so close to it, and perhaps they gave their support to the SNP. The SNP won 48 seats in 2019, which was up considerably from the 2017 performance that I'll speak about in a second. But it did appear that their European stance, their stance about being resistant to Brexit and looking to avoid Brexit, something that cut through with voters. However, in 2017, on a similar platform, the SNP actually lost a third of its seats, and the Conservatives increased their seats to, I think it was 13 in Scotland. I'd double check that. It's either 11 or 13, folks, but they increased their seats quite markedly, even though the campaign was similar to the 2019 one. So maybe the EU issue wasn't that potent. That's the point I was making earlier on, but maybe the SNP didn't make the point as clearly in 2017 as they did in 2019. And that's the kind of point that I get at here, folks, that maybe that the SNP maybe overstated or maybe underplayed or maybe didn't play as effectively in 2017 as they did in 2019. Okay, that's up for debate. So have a wee look at it, folks. Have a look to see how the EU, this kind of European policy, fits in with this European stance, this key idea, how it chimes with the Scottish electorate. Okay, it's clear from the EU referendum results is that Scotland is more Europhile than England, but does that necessarily tell at the polls? Okay, for example, the SNP might have done much better in 2019 for other reasons than the EU, and you'd have to obviously kind of dig a wee bit deeper for that, and I'll leave that up to you guys. Okay, next one. Okay, our third key idea is anti-austerity. Now, just to kind of clarify what austerity means, folks, austerity kind of means living within your means, okay, to kind of basically summarise it, okay. After the Conservatives became the leading party of government in the UK in 2010, the mantra of the Conservative government was that we as a country had to live within our means and had to cut back. So that resulted in cutting public spending on things like some welfare benefits, some public services, etc. And this was viewed in Scotland as being something that Scotland didn't want, because remember in 2010, Scotland overwhelmingly voted Labour. and it was seen as something that Scotland had rejected. Scotland had seemingly rejected the policies of austerity, this idea of cutting back. Now, the problem for Labour, and I just want to touch on Labour here in a wee second, is that after 2010, Labour was trying to win over the English electorate who believed that Labour had spent too much in power and had been far too, had thrown caution to the wind too much, rightly or wrongly. But there was a feeling within England that Labour were economically irresponsible, and that the Labour leadership felt as though they had to embrace elements of austerity. Now, in Scotland, that feeling maybe wasn't as strong. And the SNP really began to tap into this, because the SNP would then say, right, if you guys in the Labour Party are looking to appease pro-austerity policies or the pro-austerity voters, we're going to kind of outflank you on the other side. So we're going to be, for Scotland, the anti-austerity party and try to discredit Labour when they spoke about being anti-austerity. So Nicola Sturgeon would maybe say, I'm not quoting here, but would maybe say that Ed Miliband, the Labour leader at the time, is looking to appease those voters who went and voted Tory in England. We here in Scotland, the SNP, will stand up for public services, investing money, etc., etc. So again, Labour caught between a rock and a hard place on this one. And the SNP was able to frame itself as a centre-left social democratic party on most issues, okay? And they began to criticise Labour for buying into the Tory-Labour cuts consensus, because obviously Labour had to show themselves in England to being more economically responsible than they apparently had been in the minds of voters, okay? So, you'll remember that video a few minutes ago. It says, I remember when Labour used to stand up to the Tories. That bought into this agenda, this stance. The video that I have linked in to look at the sociological model for Coatbridge Crisis and Bells Hill talks about how Labour used to stand up for you and how they've abandoned their principles and that sort of thing. Nicola Sturgeon wants to tap into this sentiment and really go after this sentiment, okay? And claim that they themselves were the natural successors to Labour in terms of promoting social justice and opposing cuts and opposing austerity. Labour strenuously denied that this was the case, and Labour always argued that they were the party best able to challenge austerity. But it didn't cut through with voters. The SNP had kind of won the hearts and minds of voters, as we'll see here, folks. Okay? So the SNP anti-austerity promises, you can see some of them here in the 2015 manifesto. Now, some would rightly argue that the SNP would never be able to implement these because the SNP would never form the UK government. They don't stand in enough seats to do that. But their policies were obviously appealing. And Labour tried to counter this by saying, well, the SNP will never be in government at UK level. That's why you need to vote Labour. And Nicola Sturgeon very effectively said, we want to keep Labour honest. We want to hold their feet to the fire on this. So what the SNP were able to do is use their anti-austerity platform to outflank Labour and then say to voters who might have been thinking, oh, right enough, if we want rid of the Tories, we need to vote Labour, to say, well, we won't vote down Labour budgets, we will hold Labour's feet to the fire to make sure they keep to their promises. And that was quite an effective way of doing that, folks. Okay? Now, did the stance help the SNP? Is the question. Now, I've got a wee quote here from Andrew Geddes and Jonathan Tong from 2015. And these wee books, folks, I'm going to just kind of give you a sense of these wee books are absolutely great. You can see them there. They're called, I'll try and move that in there. They're called Britain Votes, okay, and obviously it'll have the election year after it. And it's really in depth. If you want to kind of assess elections, really, really good detail in there. So here's a wee quote from it. The SNP articulated an anti-austerity message throughout the campaign, as they had during the referendum. This further added to Labour's difficulties in Scotland. Labour's uneasy balance in opposing Conservative austerity policies whilst avoiding resurrecting images of fiscal incontinence. So Labour are, on the one hand, trying to say to voters in Middle England, listen, we've learned our lessons. We're economically responsible. We'll accept a level of cuts to public expenditure. Whereas in Scotland, saying a slightly different thing to voters, and voters in the south backed the Conservatives, voters in the north backed the SNP, and Labour was in the middle of the road. And I think that's a lesson in politics, folks. You stand in the middle of the road, you get run down. And that obviously came through. And the SNP have for a long time benefited from that kind of anti-austerity message. Some would argue that anti-austerity message would be harder to campaign on if there was a Labour government, because Labour, at Westminster, because Labour wouldn't be having to kind of go between the rock and the hard place. But obviously the SNP have been able to exploit that pretty effectively in terms of their anti-austerity position. 2017, 2 years later, the SNP lost a third of their seats, despite continuing to pursue an anti-austerity stance. Some argue that they were outflanked in this issue by Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, who gained a handful of seats in Scotland. Yeah, folks, in 2017, Labour ate into a few SNP seats that they'd won in 2015. One of the points I do want to stress, though, is that actually, see if you look at the number of votes that Labour won in 2017 in key Scottish seats, it didn't really change. And in fact, unless I'm mistaken, in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, Labour actually won less votes than they had in 2017 than they had done in 2015, but still won the seat. Now, that's because a number of voters who had backed the SNP in 2015 shifted to the Conservatives because they feared that the SNP were no longer just standing up for Scotland, they were supporting a second independence referendum. So the argument that Labour outflanked the SNP in 2017 perhaps needs a bit more analysis, folks, in terms of, and a bit more investigation. I'm not convinced that's the case in terms of the data that I've looked at, although it's been an argument that's been put forward that because Jeremy Corbyn offered a radical anti-austerity agenda, it was a direct challenge to the SNP. I'm not convinced in that. The big winners, obviously the SNP won the most amount of seats in 2017, but the big gainers in 2017 were the Conservative Party, not Labour. Even though Labour won a few seats, their vote didn't really change, their vote didn't really go up. It was because the Conservative rising vote harmed the SNP, and that allowed a Labour MP to be elected in key seats like Rutherglen, like Coatbridge, etc. Okay, 2019, I want you to maybe think about how the anti-austerity message fit in 2019. I'm going to let you guys assess that yourselves, folks. Okay, so this brings us near the conclusion of the SNP. These kind of three key themes, and I know I've gone through Stronger for Scotland a bit more in depth, I think, folks, just marginally, and I've given quite a bit of background. So Stronger for Scotland, Scotland and Europe, anti-austerity. I think a good starting point is maybe to look at these three, and having assessed the evidence, and take time to assess the evidence yourselves, rank them which ones have been the most successful, the second most successful, and the third most successful. I think each of them have played their own role in an interlinked way in terms of how the SNP have done. But what you would do is you would look at how they have either positively affected the SNP's performance or negatively affected. Okay? Obviously the SNP are doing very well, so you might want to look at counter-arguments. Stronger for Scotland, is it all that? Scotland and Europe? Is the EU really that important to Scottish voters, even though they voted to remain in? You would obviously look at that and you begin to weigh it up. Okay, I'm going to link you in one more. I'm going to show you one more documentary that you might want to check out at your own time, folks, and this will help with the background. I mentioned it earlier on. Okay, just give me 1 second and I'll have a look at it. Okay, so here is the documentary that I was talking about. This channel here, folks, Thatcherite Scott, I think we know what that person believes in, but some really great documentaries that they've captured on this channel, and this one is called Portillo on Salmond. Portillo is a former Conservative minister. He was Shadow Chancellor, he was Defence Secretary in government, he was a one-time Conservative Party leadership candidate at UK level, and he tracks the kind of background to the SNP, and in particular Salmon's role in this. Obviously in recent times Nicola Sturgeon has become the kind of key figure, and obviously at the moment there's a bit of tension between the two of those figures for various other reasons. But I would maybe check this out if you're looking for a bit of background on the SNP, folks. It's an absolutely excellent documentary in terms of the lead up to power in recent years. Okay, it doesn't cover the referendum years or anything like that, but it's really good for kind of showing where the SNP have come from and I suppose where they're going. Okay, so it's well worth checking out. Okay, and I would heartily recommend it. Okay, so the next instalment that I'll look at is the Conservative Party, around about the same period, and about how their kind of pro-austerity message has gone down with voters, how their European position has gone down as well, and also about how the Conservatives have fared in Scotland with their unionism. So what you will have is you will have three similar themes in the next video, and that will allow you to compare the SNP with the Conservatives in terms of their relative election successes. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, folks. If you do have any questions, please get in touch. And obviously watch those videos as a kind of supplement to what you're doing, because no knowledge is too much knowledge. Okay, take care, all the best, folks. Bye bye.